Good morning. A warm welcome to the Humanist community in Silicon Valley Sunday Forum, to those joining us on Zoom and for those meeting here in person. My name is Alex Savasy. I'm Vice President of the Humanist community. The Humanist community is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. Humanism is a secular and reality-based philosophy of life that affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. We value freedom, health, happiness, fairness, compassion, and using science and reason to acquire and apply knowledge. Am I getting an echo? Okay. If these words describe your thinking, we invite you to become a member of the Humanist community if you haven't done so already. Membership forms are available on our website at humanist.org. A special welcome to those who are with us for the first time. We invite you to continue listening to our weekly forums and other events. You can find all our events listed on the website at humanist.org. That's Humanist plural. Please aid us in continuing to present these forums by donating to the Humanist community, and you can find out how to donate to our organization on our website, again, www.humanist.org. This Sunday, Tim Rosenberger Jr. is here to discuss saving free discourse and our universities. Tim Rosenberger Jr. is of the Federalist Society, is the president of the Federalist Society at Stanford, and he'll discuss saving free discourse in our universities, why we should care about our institutions of elite study, and how we can help them find ongoing relevance. Tim?
Thank you for inviting me to be with you this morning. I am still the president of the Federalist Society for one more week. So this is the keynote of the farewell tour. I thought I'd start today. I know many of you already are familiar somewhat with the events that happened at Stanford, but I thought I'd give you sort of the longer version of what we saw, sort of captured the news media's attention a few weeks ago, and then talk a bit about the implications I think it has for our society and particularly for our universities. This all started, it turns out, quite a while ago in May of 2022. We had just elected our new board for the Federalist Society, and we actually start planning our list of speakers pretty early. And one of the very first speakers we invited, perhaps the first, I'm not quite sure, but either the first or within the first three, was Judge Kyle Duncan. Judge Duncan sits on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Baton Rouge. So Fifth Circuit covers Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And you might wonder, why are we, this law school in California, inviting this judge from Louisiana to come speak to us? And the reason is because of the way, many of you probably know this, but we're going to review it anyway, the way affirmative litigation works in this country. So that's when you are filing a lawsuit, usually in some public interest-y type forum, to try to provoke a precedent, either from a circuit court or ideally to get something to the Supreme Court that will reshape the law nationwide. And so when people on the left want to do this, they file here in California in the Ninth Circuit. So the Ninth Circuit covers California, Hawaii, a bunch of other Western states. You file in the Ninth Circuit, you're likely to get a judge at the district level who will go your way. If it gets appealed, you really want to get a nationwide injunction often at the district level, but if it gets appealed, you're still in the Ninth Circuit, so you probably get a decision your way. And then it's up to the Supreme Court to either overrule that decision or not. If you're on the right, you don't want to file this in California. You want to file it down in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. You go through the Fifth Circuit. When we're curating our list of speakers for the year, we try to get a good balance, particularly with the judges, of people who we think of as friends of our chapter. So these are judges who hire clerks from Stanford all the time, who are alumni, who have some other connection to Stanford, and then people we've never heard from before, have had very little exposure to. And Judge Duncan fell into that category. He attended Louisiana State Law. He was down in Baton Rouge. He'd never spoken at Stanford before, and he had never hired from Stanford before. He had extended an offer to a student a few years ago, and that student had then reneged on going to clerk for him. So we had we wanted to get him back to campus and back to meet some of our newer students and see if he wanted to hire some clerks. And we also wanted to hear from him because we wanted to hear about what was happening in the Fifth Circuit. So he was to come and speak, and specifically he was going to talk about gun regulation and regulation of social media. So those are two big things moving through the Fifth Circuit, particularly through Texas. Texas had passed a law that would put new regulations on social media companies, particularly Twitter. And this was moving through the Fifth Circuit. We wanted to hear his thoughts on it. Fast forward to a few weeks ago. Judge Duncan was to come the following Thursday. And on Sunday, an email was sent to everyone on the board of the Federalist Society at Stanford, obviously including me. And it said, to paraphrase, the undersigned students view Judge Duncan's presence on our campus as a threat. Having him here is violence against the following affinity groups and communities. And we encourage you to either, or I don't think it was encouraged, we demand that you either move this event onto Zoom or you move it off campus. And so this judge who sits one level below the Supreme Court, was going to fly in from Baton Rouge, not a direct flight, you might know, come here. And then I was supposed to tell him, well, thanks for coming. Please go back to your hotel room and log on to Zoom. We look forward to hearing from you through that medium. So we weren't going to do that. But we pondered, what would be sort of the most conciliatory response to this. And what we ultimately went with was a pretty short email from me. And it said, Judge Duncan will still be coming and speaking as planned. As always, we'll have a lengthy Q&A. So please come to the Q&A, ask questions. But given the language of this email, maybe people don't want to be around when he's here. So here's when he's going to be here. And so if you don't want to be, in this room at that time, that's fine too. And also, here's my phone number. If anybody wants to talk to me individually, that's fine too. Nobody did. Tuesday afternoon, I had a standing meeting with student affairs. So we plan a big symposium every year. And we're doing one on tech and regulation this year. So I was meeting with student affairs to sort of coordinate that upcoming event. And as sort of a coda on that meeting, we talked about this email and what we expected to happen. There have been protests of guests invited by the Federalist Society before. About a year ago for Constitution Day, Judge Patrick Bumatai, who sits on the Ninth Circuit, he sits in San Diego, came to speak about his experience as the first openly gay judge who's been appointed. But he was protested. He was a Federalist Society guest. He was protested, and there was a walkout. So there was a protest. What the protest was, he started speaking. A bunch of people who had sort of shown up early and made sure they got the front row seats stood up and walked out, and that was the protest. And so this has sort of been the kind of protest we expect at Stanford. So I met with student affairs, and they said, what do you think is going to happen? And I said, I have no idea. What do you think is going to happen? I think probably nothing. And they said, that sounds right. And so that was basically what we covered. They did, after that meeting, send out to the Federalist Society board and the people signed on this email that had said, we demand you move this off campus, a copy of Stanford Law School's policies on protest and disruption, because of course Stanford already has long policies, right? Everything has a policy. So you can ask questions, you can make your voice heard, you can have a sign. What you can't do, you can't impede access to a building, right? So if a speaker wants to come into an auditorium, you can't prevent them from coming in. And you can't disrupt their event. You can't act in a way or speak in a way that prevents the speaker from being able to speak. There's also this sort of dark, in hindsight, sentence attached to this email, the version I got, that said, guests only are allowed to come as invitees of student groups. So if you want to disinvite him, you can. And it was like, well, I'm not going to disinvite this judge 2 days out. It's sort of strange. So Thursday, the judge arrived, and he came a bit early. Like the event was at 12:45. He was there at like 11 o'clock. So I wasn't really sure what to do with him. So I took him over to a coffee shop, and we got drinks and we're talking. And we'd given him a heads up that we'd gotten this email. He said, what do you think is going to happen today? And I said, I don't think anything of particular interest, right? Like we've had protests before, there might be a walkout. I wouldn't be too worried about it. As we started to come towards campus, we could hear this, or towards the law school campus, we could hear this noise. And I wasn't quite sure what we were hearing, but apparently the school had set up this safe space support area behind the law school. And I think the idea of this was it was an alternate venue for people who were going to protest to sort of be together and be supportive of one another. But this seems to have not quite worked. It ended up being more of like a pep rally for the protest. And then the people all came to the protest. So it didn't quite work, but maybe it was done with good intention. And as we walked towards campus, we started to see all these signs, and there were sort of three genres of signs that were up. There was one that was photos of everyone on the board of the Federalist Society, and it said, you should be ashamed. Okay. There was one that had sort of non-sourced bullet points of various wrongs that Judge Duncan had supposedly done. So it would say like, this judge has disenfranchised Black voters. This judge has, whatever. And then there was the third poster, which I really didn't appreciate, which said that the Federalist Society and its guests lead to trans suicide. And you might think this is sort of a strange thing to single out. But the reason why it was particularly hurtful is there was a trans student at Stanford Law School who committed suicide last year, who was a member of the Federalist Society. So sort of asserting that we were in some way culpable for this, our friend's death, was not great. And there's sort of this other weird thing that this was a person who had chronic health conditions, and Stanford's solution for him during the COVID lockdown was just like sit in your dorm for 2 years, right? Like they made no effort to do anything for him. I mean, he just was sort of put in the storm, and I think he became very depressed. Like we can never know why people commit suicide, but I don't think it was because of the trans thing. I think it was because of the chronic illness and this deep isolation and depression. He was on Law Review, and he and I did an article together, and he would just tell me, like, he's like, I have been told I should not go to the library, so can you go scan things for me? And so I would. But I mean, this is somebody who just didn't see people for a very extended period of time. And I think that was very, very bad. So anyway, the judge and I got to the building, and when we entered, there had been this sort of gauntlet of people set up from the entrance to the room. It was like an L-shaped hallway you go down. And as we entered, initially people were chanting these sort of like middle school cheers, hey, hey, ho, ho, Federalists have got to go, whatever. But by the time we got to the end, there were individual people who were yelling very vile things at the judge. And, it sort of had taken a dark turn from being sort of conventional protest, something much more personal and much more borderline violent. Then we entered the room, and I gave my little introduction, and he started speaking. And there was like a lot of noise. So there was noise happening, but there was also direct, and there's a recording of this, I think many of you probably already heard, but there's also direct crosstalk. So any word he would say or any sentence he would say would invite a response from somebody else, like yell something at him. And so he limped along for a little more than 10 minutes, at which point he says, look, is there an administrator here? And there were 5 administrators from the law school at that point there. Interestingly, I'd gotten an email that morning that said, just so you know, campus security won't be at this event because, some of the groups have sent us emails saying that they feel uncomfortable with campus security. So just so you know, they won't be there. And I didn't really think much of this. I thought, okay, I'm not expecting anything to require campus security. There are 5 administrators there for reasons that remain unclear to me. The one who was sort of sent down or who went down, I'm not sure if it was a send or a self-directed thing, was the Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So this is someone who would never be involved in like disciplinary work of the law school. Like if you look at the org chart, this person sits over by like therapy, and there were people there who sit over by discipline, right? Who would do like bar recommendations and things like that. And they were in the room, but they didn't do anything. So for some reason, Dean Steinbach is sent down and has this sort of strange conversation with the judge, and then looks at me and says, can I speak? And I go, like, it's up to the judge. And then she ends up sort of on the dais and gives this seemingly pre-written lecture to him and to the room. And it includes the sort of clause that much has been made of, as she says, I hope you understand and can learn from the people here, because the way you judge, your decisions have been harmful, have caused these people harm. And I hope there's something you have to say that's so important that it's worth causing all of this strife in this community and tearing people apart. Is the juice worth the squeeze? And that's sort of the big sentence. And then she gets off the dais, and some students started filming during that. So you have this sort of, clip of the video there. But what isn't totally clear in that video is things don't totally get better then. There's a bit of a change in the dynamic of the room, but people are still heckling him and he still can't really speak. And then one of the other administrators comes down and speaks with one of the students who's leading the protest. And then that student stands up. So I don't know what's said there, but this student stands up and says, okay, we should probably tone down the heckling a bit. Half of you leave in protest and half of you stay here to bear witness. So a bunch of people leave. And at that point, there's just less noise and less crosstalk. And the judge can kind of speak, but remember, this is an event. This is a 1 hour event. We're about halfway through it now. It was set up to be a 20-ish minute talk followed by Q&A. So he just skips the talk and goes into Q&A. And the Q&A does not go well, right? People ask him these either sort of bad faith or bizarre questions. He gets in it to someone with a sign about how he can't find the clit, and like gets into this talk with this guy. And the room gets more tense again. But at this point, we're about at time. So the federal marshals who have shown up, he did not order them. It is unclear to me how they knew to show up or why they were there. But federal marshals show up and take him and me out of the room and into this sort of alley behind the law school. They put him in a car and they drive away. And then for about a day and a half after this, no one cares at all. Like Stanford's campus newspaper doesn't cover this, right? Like they had a student there to cover the event and this person took some pictures, but like, there's nothing on the website. There's nothing in the newspaper. No one cares. And I wonder, have I like lost it? Have I like lost the plot? Because it seemed very strange to me. It seemed not like something that would happen at what is supposedly now America's top ranked law school, but no one cared. And then over the weekend, some things started showing up on Twitter, right? Some people I'd never heard of started posting these videos that students had taken. And then by the following Monday, all of a sudden, like actual media picked this story up, and it was just, people cared a lot, it seemed, which was a bit of a surprise. Also over the weekend, sort of in the middle of this sudden media interest, but a solid 2 days after the actual event, an apology letter comes out. It's signed by the dean of the law school, but also by the president of the university. So I'm not sure what was going on there that the president felt he needed to get involved. They write this letter of apology to the judge. And the letter includes this relatively innocuous paragraph that says, administrators in the room did not abide by our, standards or something of that effect. And I think it was even weaker than that way. It was efforts to control the room, though well-intentioned, fell short of our, At which point, a bunch of these student groups who led this protest send out mass emails to the entire law school student body, one of which says, we can't believe that the dean would throw her excellent colleague under the bus. This was Stanford Law School at its best. And so I'm like, I don't really know what to make of this. Things continue to percolate for like another week and a half. And it was a weird moment. Judge Duncan was our last event of the year. We were then going to go into study days and finals. So it was sort of a strange time, but sort of the nastiness between students got worse. And eventually the dean of the law school, Dean Martinez, puts out this very long, like 10-page statement on the events. And she says a lot of things that I certainly agree with. And I suspect, based on what I know of the humanists, many of you would agree with about the importance of free speech and the importance of discourse and the way the academy should work. I used to be her research assistant. I know she's an excellent writer. This was her at her best. It was very good writing. But when it boils down to what happens now, it isn't quite clear that there's a plan. There's going to be a committee that's going to think about the policies around free speech. So it's very interesting. I also found out through this that the university, the whole Stanford project, the faculty senate had agreed to create a committee on free speech more than a year ago, but that committee remains unappointed because it is held up in the committee on committees, which I found very interesting. But the law school is going to have its own committee, which the dean will just appoint. There's no committee on committees, so they're going to do something. And supposedly before the end of the year, now the end of the year is in like a month, so there's not much time, there's going to be a day-long training on free speech for students. And that's basically what's happened, right? That we've been promised a committee, we've been promised this training. We haven't really seen any difference. The Federalist Society has had a few more events since Judge Duncan, including some with judges. A number of judges and speakers who were planning on coming emailed me and were like, look, I like the idea of coming to Stanford. I don't feel called to be a medieval martyr. Like, am I gonna be yelled at by crazy people, or am I just gonna give a talk? And it's definitely calm now, but it's calm as a function of the fact that the events are now limited to Stanford people, pretty much. We have to specially approve individually people from the community who want to come, which is a shame because our events used to be just sort of open to the public. Anyone who wanted to show up could. And I think that led to some really rich discussions because there would be legal practitioners and people in the community who had expertise in whatever our speaker was talking on, who would ask really insightful questions that often our law students didn't have the experience and background to be able to ask. So this has changed who can come to our events, which is a shame. And we also now have a bunch of administrators at every event sort of babysitting. And this is a weird thing because the age of people in law school has gone up over the last couple decades. So the average age of somebody in this room is like 27 years old. And they now have these babysitters to make sure that they don't, yell at each other and behave badly. And so at any event, we usually have someone from student affairs there just to sort of watch and hang out. And someone from the main university comes to be the university agent. And it's been explained to me, in the event of a disruption, the university agent will stand up and read this proclamation that the event has been disrupted and then call campus security. And it feels very sort of infantilizing, but the events are calm. What gives me a great deal of concern is there are really two different problems here. And it seems that the work that's being done, both the committee and this training, address sort of the smaller and easier problem. And the smaller and easier problem is, what are our policies, right? What are the rules? What are the rules about what is a disruption, what isn't? I think probably the existing rules were fine. Sort of the weird thing in the Judge Duncan event is Dean Steinbach stands up and says, oh, this isn't a disruption. And it seems like that was probably incorrect, right? But they're going to tweak and reword the regulations or the rules of speech during events. And the upshot of this will presumably be that there will be some sort of tighter process to make sure that there's a clear delineation between protest and disruption. But that doesn't really address what I think is the bigger and more complicated problem, which is the way people treat one another, right? The purported mystique of law is it's one of the three great professions alongside the clergy, which I imagine is not a big one for the humanists, and medicine. And the assumption is that there's this sort of higher standard. The question is not what can I get away with, right? How close can I get to the line of disruption? It's how am I a professional in community with these people who will be my future colleagues? And that we don't seem to have any plan on at all, right? There just seems to be, people are going to be very balkanized and really dislike each other, and it's going to be very sort of miserable for everyone. And tied in with that, of course, is the behavior, yelling at the judge as he's walking in. I hope your kids get raped. Technically not a disruption, right? I mean, not a disruption, objectively not a disruption, right? That is someone yelling something as he's walking in. They're not preventing him from entering the room, but still not something you want to have happening, right? Something that really seems to be sort of beyond the pale of acceptable discourse. So there's sort of this bigger problem I'm quite worried about. It's been interesting that in the aftermath of this event, a lot of people mostly on the right, but some on the left have sent me their sort of thoughts on what needs to happen with universities and free speech. And there are a couple of these strands that I think are are not quite right. And I want to talk about those. So the one is, I think, informed by a sort of deep pessimism about the state of the country, the state of the universities, the state of a lot of things. And it is, universities are over, right? Move somewhere somewhat remote and encourage your children to take up a trade, and they can live like a good and honorable life, and that'll be fine. And I think this has several problems. One, it sort of betrays preconceived belief that people are holding when they say this, which is that society in some irreparable way is going to collapse, right? That the structures, things like, I think it's a lot of people, I think were deeply impacted by COVID, right? Sort of lost faith in medicine, and then that sort of trickled into other categories. Now they're just like, I have no trust of any expert, and I'm not going to be an expert. I'm going to live like a very simple life, and so will my children, and so should society. And that seems like not a great idea. I think you want good and honorable people to keep going into the professions, to keep working and keep trying to build society towards something better and forward-looking. The second camp is the big universities, Stanford, the other elite names you've heard of. Those specific universities are over. So we can still have universities, but everyone needs to go to Liberty or Grove City, and or new universities that haven't been created yet, right? There will be new universities that will be sort of built, and they will be better on things like free speech. University of Austin, which is like the thing Barry Weiss is involved in, keeps being held up to me. And I think, we're a growing country. We can always use more universities. Fact is, Stanford has between 30 and 40 billion with a B dollars. And so, even if you create a really good new thing, even if you get really impressive people to want to teach there and be part of its academic life, it's going to be really hard to equal the weight of these blue chip universities. There's really never been anything like it before. Like Oxford and Cambridge had names, but they never had money like this. And so the big universities have so much money that they are going to shape the way the academy works for the foreseeable future. And you can't just give up on them and say, oh, well, these universities are over. And it's interesting, people on the left have reached out to me and they've said, oh, well, we think this letter from your dean is great and it fixes the problem. And I think it's a very well-written letter. I think what's concerning about it is it's unclear she really has the mandate from her colleagues and certainly from the students to bring it into reality. What you seem to have seen at Stanford across the enterprise of it, but particularly within the law school, is a sort of theological milieu that's taken it over. There's these set of beliefs that people are expected to hold and that are enforced by sort of people with non-reason-based, non-discourse-based way of enforcing. And if you deviate from those views, you will be anathematized. You'll be anathematized socially. And this is true for professors too. We have had professors who have sort of unusual views. Some of them are, like card-carrying Democrats, but they say the wrong things about crime, for example. And then they will not come here because they visit Stanford and Stanford would like to hire them. And then they realize they would have no friends, right? It's actually very, very hard to be on a faculty, a small faculty at a law school like that, where no one will stick up for you and no one will invite you over for dinner, and it's very unpleasant. And so, we've lost multiple people to the University of Chicago because they've been a bit stronger on this, and we've lost people to law schools that are not ones you would think of as peers of Stanford, Chicago, some sort of flagship state schools where people have just said, I will be free to do the academic work I want, and I will have a social community where I have friends and can raise my kids and have a pleasant experience. And that's very, very worrying. So, is there a real plan to sort of push back on this particularized secular theology and to say, we don't operate that way. We're a university. We're committed to discourse. We're committed to speech. That's what the letter would imply. But how to carry that forward is not clear to me. I thought maybe this committee would be tasked with that, but I've talked with some of the people who are considering being on the committee, and their mandate is to write policies, right? They're going to write policies about how students conduct themselves and presumably how faculty conduct themselves, but they're not going to deal with that bigger cultural problem. And so unless that can be attacked, I don't have a lot of hope. So that's not a particularly inspiring or pleasant note to conclude on, but that's the end of what I've got. And I suspect you all have lots of questions based on a little bit of pre-talk before I got up here. So I'd love to hear from any of you and have a little back and forth.
Yeah, thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
It struck me that what you're talking about is policy is all very good. The problem seems to be enforcing the policy. What sort of punishment can you mete out to the students?
I don't think that's quite what I'm saying. I think that there is a question of enforcement of policy. I think what went wrong here was non-enforcement policy. But I think the bigger problem is a cultural one, right? Like, you probably don't want to have a policy for 27-year-olds that says wash your hands after going to the bathroom. And you also probably don't want to have a policy that says, like, don't yell, I hope your kids get raped at guests at the university, right? Like, it doesn't matter who I invite. Like, even if I invite the worst person ever, you don't yell that.
Okay. Did you feel that a lot of the really vocal demonstrators at that talk, were they guests? I mean, were they students?
Yeah, I think the most vocal demonstrators were students, and I think there's sort of a couple tranches of people. So there are the sort of embarrassing demonstrators. So the guy that got into the conversation with the judge about a clit, right? Like, that's embarrassing, but it's actually not violent or offensive, right? It's just sort of weird. And then there are the people who were sort of ginned up and violent and mean, both to other attendees and to the judge. And those were students. I think there is sort of just this atmosphere of the mob that led to that, right? Like, I don't think these are bad people individually. I think you just get swept up in the group, and there was nothing to diffuse it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that seems to be a problem with our times too. And
Absolutely.
I tend to blame it on the media, because everything we get is dramatic and emotional.
Right.
No further comments. I see. I had a question about you mentioned after the talk the school marshal. Is that
Not a school marshal, the U.S. Federal Marshals.
Federal Marshal?
Yeah.
It's almost like being escorted off the campus by.
Yeah. I mean, the judge, they took off. Like, they walked him out. They put him in a car. You know, a car.
How did he feel like about that? And did he feel like he was being arrested?
I think he felt pretty relieved. You know, it's not. It's hard to imagine how it could have moved from rhetorical violence into physical violence, but it felt scary in a way. It was very weird. There were just so many people, and they were so angry, and the energy was so bad. It was unclear what would diffuse it. So I think he was sort of relieved that they took him out. Matt,
I see you've got your hand up.
First of all, is my microphone working? I've been having problems with it recently. Sounds okay? Okay. It sounds like in this talk, you're complaining about people exercising free speech so that you can exercise your free speech. Am I missing something here?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of the less interesting question, which is the policy question. But Stanford has always had a distinction between, I guess I'm not actually looking at you. I should look at the camera. Sorry. Stanford has always had a distinction between speech, okay, and preventing others from speaking, not okay. And so if you want to have a protest, that is allowed. If you want to hold up a sign, that is allowed. If you want to get a group of 50 people to yell things so that an invited speaker can't be heard or can't do a speech, that's considered a disruption, not allowed. So I think that's a question of sort of policy. I think it's maybe a less interesting question than the question of how do people comport themselves, which is, you know, not totally a free speech question, but if you're purporting to enter this noble profession, your speech should have stakes. It should matter. It should advance the ball in some way. And like yelling at a federal judge about the clit probably isn't that kind of speech.
So you're more interested in the problem of like people yelling and screaming terrible things so that this judge can nicely and calmly say terrible things.
Well, I mean, the judge was going to talk about regulation of Twitter, so maybe you think that that's a terrible thing, but yeah, I mean, I don't really know how to answer.
I mean, it sounded like in the early part of your speech, he was going to talk about gun regulation and I forget the second one.
Yeah, he's going to talk about regulation of firearms and social media.
And social media. I mean, especially now we're having a big conversation about firearms, and there's a lot of the same old stuff being said that is not great. But and I can see why people can have a lot of emotions about these sort of topics. But again, I mean, they didn't stop you from getting in the event. The big thing seems to be that they were yelling and making a lot of noise while the talk was going on. I'm not sure. I'm not too worried about that myself, but you know, I've a policy issue. There seems to be some issues with your organization not preparing enough beforehand. Obviously this was not expected, but making sure that there was more security there if you're going to try and send these people out would have been good. I know what you said that somebody sent an email saying that there shouldn't be security there, but that was kind of something you probably should have verified was going to be there, something like that.
Well, I want to clarify that email saying there would not be security was from a dean of the university. So I don't know what I would have done there.
Well, no, it sounded like somebody had told the dean that they were worried about security being there and they didn't want it there. Following up to like make sure that they're talking to this dean beforehand, trying to get security there. I don't know what could have been done more, but it seemed like there was a lot of stuff that you weren't expecting happened. And I'm not sure, it sounded like there's a lack of preparation to some respect there. I don't know what you're expecting administrators to do that were there, but yeah, I mean, you got to remove the disruptors if that's the.
Well, I would rather not have to remove anyone, right? I think people should comport themselves in a good way. And you can say we have maybe serious disagreements about something like gun regulation, but it's not like people were asking tough questions about gun regulation, right? I mean, people were yelling about the clit or, yelling they hope his daughters get raped, and that doesn't have anything to do with gun regulation. I think that the rationale for that second one was it was like a protest about the Fifth Circuit jurisprudence on abortion, but I don't think that's a legitimate way of raising your concerns about that.
Okay, I don't think we're going to come to a conclusion here. I'll let Michael speak next, or somebody else there.
Okay. Hi. So I have a big question and a few smaller questions, but let me start from a big one. I don't know how much I could generalize from this one incident that you described, but I read about other similar incidents that all seem to follow the same pattern. So the university invites a speaker known for their controversial positions on some issue. And those who disagree, students mostly, they feel like they have no voice, no way to express their alternative opinion other than by protesting. And that's what they are doing. I'm not approving this, but anyway. My question is, why don't universities do this as a sort of debate? So instead of inviting someone who is expressing one side on the issue, always invite people, or at least try to invite people who are expressing different views on this issue. And of course, it should be a mediated debate, but the goal of this mediation is not to suppress anyone's opinion, but just to ensure that no one can monopolize the conversation. So if you have 20 minutes, this should be enforced. It's no matter what are your opinions. So, and I know some organizations that actually use these facilitated debates very effectively, and it takes nothing from the experience. They are still very passionate, very interesting, but people don't feel like they don't have a voice in this case.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to, I think there are sort of two pieces of that quickly. The first is, there's sort of a slippery slope here. You remember a few years ago, Ann Coulter, Milo Yiannopoulos, various people were speaking, And there were big protests, and they were sort of hounded off of campuses. And at the time, many people, I think somewhat including me, thought, well, they're very controversial speakers. Students feel they don't have a voice. They're going to protest, whatever. I think why this caught people's imagination was, this wasn't someone who was like an Instagram celebrity. This was a presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed judge, right? And you might disagree with that judge's judging. You might disagree very vehemently, but this is a serious person with serious things to say, or at least a person who is going to wield power, and so you probably want to hear from. And so having that sort of mob rule response to someone like this suggests that, allowing that for the more controversial speakers just means it's going to get ramped up, right? Just, what is seen as too controversial or controversial enough to be acceptable to have this response is just going to keep moving in towards sort of mainstream opinions. In terms of debate, Michael, I totally agree with you. We always want to have a debate. We try to organize debates whenever we're having a speaker, even on sort of uncontroversial things like, the regulatory state, things like that. Historically, the Federalist Society was very good at doing debates. They would invite some speaker from the outside, and they would find someone on the faculty at the host university to counter that position. Whether the guest speaker was on the right or the left, they would find someone to come counter that position. Unfortunately, in recent years, we found it nearly impossible to get faculty members to come to our events and come to our debates. A number of them send us back a form email that apparently came from a faculty member at NYU, and it basically says, because of the events of January 6th, I cannot lend my good name to legitimizing the Federalist Society, and so I will not be able to participate. I mean, it's a bit longer than that, but that's the thrust of it. We had Adam Mortara come speak this past week. Adam Mortara was the lead lawyer in the Asians versus Harvard lawsuit over affirmative action. We had a professor agree to debate him, and then about 20 hours before the event, I got an email that said, oh, I have a scheduling conflict. I didn't notice. I will not be able to come for the debate. And so, that is an issue that we would love to have had a debate on. And instead we had, an interesting speech by Adam Mortara and some good questions that sort of pushed back on some of his points, but it wasn't as rich as a debate would have been. And I agree with you. Debates should be the norm, and we would love help from the university in facilitating those. But it's basically now at the point that we either hear the one side or we don't hear any side.
Just out of curiosity, do you find debates take longer than speakers?
No. I think that most questions of law can be expressed pretty succinctly. And so if you tell a speaker you have 40 minutes, they'll take 40 minutes. And if you tell them you have 15 minutes, and then the other guy's gonna have 15 minutes, and then you're gonna, interact with each other in the audience, they can say what they need to say in 15 minutes. So it's actually, I think, just a more fun, richer setup when you do debate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can give a more general question.
Yeah.
Thank you. What's happening in this country? I was at Stanford 30 years ago, and I experienced the exact same thing. I studied international relations, not law. I witnessed heckling on numerous occasions. Once I was actually the target of it, not because I gave a speech, but because I asked a question. I was walking on campus the next day, and someone comes up to me and says, "Hey, Zem, I heard you almost got lynched yesterday," which was not really a vision that I had, but I guess that's the way it maybe looked to some people. And there seems to be a cultural aggressiveness, vileness, and at first I'm tempted to say, well, this is coming from the left. It seems on college campuses that it's the left mostly responsible for it. But when you look at the national stage, the biggest bullies are Republicans, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jordan, Donald Trump, of course, huge bully, right? So it's what is happening? I mean, if Judge Duncan gets heckled, that's one thing. When Chris Rock gets heckled, that's something else. I mean, stand-up comedians say they don't want to, go to college campuses because they get heckled. I mean, this is just beyond the pale. Michael, you mentioned debates. Recently, I kind of read into this a little bit before today's talk because I find it so fascinating. The Federalist Society recently wanted to hold a debate at the Brigham Young University, a Mormon university, about the Dobbs decision. Okay, and they were going to have two sides. The Dobbs decision is the one that overturned Roe v. Wade, right? And that was protested. The idea of holding a debate on this topic. It wasn't a one-sided, speech, which, by the way, I have no problem with whatsoever. Someone comes in and offers a point of view on something. Even a debate is now off limits, it seems. I mean, what is your, you kind of mentioned this overarching topic of, is it just in the academy? Is it in the country as a whole? I mean, what hope do we have, moving forward? I know this is more of a rant than a question.
I mean, country as a whole, I need to think more about. I think the academy has a special problem right now. I think there were trends leading to this problem, but COVID really accelerated it, which is the aggrandizement of more and more of the life of the university to administrators, right? And I teach undergrads in policy classes, and I ask them, what are you doing this Friday? And they're like, oh, we're going to go play video games in our own dorms with each other, but not together, right? People are not, almost none of them have ever dated anyone, right? There's this extended childhood facilitated by the university. And the answer at Stanford is, we see students are getting more depressed, our suicide numbers are up, students feel more anxiety, right? And the answer is just throwing more and more money at it, which turns out is the wrong thing. So they hire more therapists and they facilitate more events. But as a consequence, students don't actually own or control anything, right? Even the student organizations are effectively run by university administrators. You have to ask for permission to get the room for your speaker. You have to ask for permission to invite the speaker. You have to ask for permission to have money to buy lunch. You're not allowed to have your own bank account if you're a student group, right? Student groups, all the money has to move through the university, has to be watched very closely by the administration. And so this same culture of, the undergrads have sort of distilled it down. Some undergrads have noticed they've distilled it down to Stanford hates fun. There's a hashtag. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but Stanford does hate fun, right? They don't want you going out. They don't want you drinking. They don't want you having parties. They don't want frats, right? They don't like the frats. And there are some bad things about the frats, but I think really the problem with them is they had their own organization and they gave students agency. And so you have this law school where people are 30 years old and they have to be babysat through lunch. And that's a very bad thing, right? I think when people feel disempowered and infantilized, they respond to that. And the way you respond to that is by behaving badly, right? You feel you lack agency, you lack sort of power over your life. You don't really feel like you can stand up to these speakers. And so you expect the university to protect you, but you're also sort of lashing out against it. I think it's very toxic. Residential life now, everyone lives on campus. Most of the graduate students live on campus. And, if you can't get along with your roommate, they have an administrator to help you with that. And it's like, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in a pretty blue collar community, and people my age have children. And if they don't have children, they're single and they live with other people, they are on a lease. And if they don't get along with their roommate, they work it out, right? They don't get to go meet with someone in student affairs and have this facilitated. I mean, this is a real problem that people are getting very, very old to not be adults. And I think with the academy, that's the particular problem. The nationwide thing is probably not totally dissimilar in that people really don't feel like they have any agency, right? If you're in the middle of this country, there are no economic opportunities to speak of. My home community in Cleveland, you have people who are older than anyone here who worked at GM and have a pension and own a house. And everyone in the family lives there, right? Mm-hmm. And they all have these constellations of jobs. They all work 100 hours a week and they work 30 hours at Target and 30 hours in landscaping and 30 hours, whatever. And each of these jobs pay, $14 an hour. Some of these people have college degrees and are doing this. I mean, can you imagine how demoralizing? You borrow all this money to get a college degree and they're like, okay, you can be someone who cuts the grass for the parks department that requires a bachelor's degree. And you're like, this is nuts. How demoralizing. And so people feel this sense of not having any control over their lives. And so they lash out in random ways. You have to find, if you become a victim, you have to find who's victimizing you.
I think that goes a long way back too. I remember as a kid, you get up in the morning and your parents would say, "Oh, all right, get out of the house, go outside and play."
Yeah.
And you go out and get in trouble and get out of trouble and
Yes.
get home when the street lights come on. It's dark. Jerry.
Yeah, so I guess this is a little off topic, but I still want to ask it. I think you briefly mentioned collapse, and I get the impression that you don't take it seriously. But there are a lot of people who take the possibility of collapse quite seriously in this country, and I think with good reason. So I'd like to know what you really think about the possibility of collapse.
Oh, I think I am actually probably more of a believer in collapse than the average person. I hope I didn't come across, I don't take it seriously, but I think it's a very, very dangerous thing, either individually or societally, to build around. I think if you're building around an actual plan to avert collapse, that's probably worthwhile. But if we atomize to the point where we are building around surviving the collapse individually, I think that's very corrosive for our society and very corrosive for us as individuals. So, it's one thing to say, I'm going to be very, very involved in trying to, help the environment. If you think that's the source of collapse, I'm sort of more of a believer in sort of political and social collapse, but, I would love to work on that. But I think you do that work in the academy, in the halls of power, in whatever way you do it. If you say, basically, the collapse is inevitable, and so I'm going to move to Tennessee, and I'm going to make sure my property has its own source of fresh water. You've sort of voted with the collapse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I think that these attempts by individuals to take care of themselves, you don't know how it's going to turn out. I mean, these attempts are not likely to be successful if we do have a real collapse. Also, in the environment versus political, they affect each other, so they're not independent.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like giving up. You go off by yourself. You're worried about the zombie apocalypse or something.
Yeah.
And you're going to have a gun.
Yeah, well, a gun. You're going to need.
Oh yeah.
You're going to need a truck of guns, right? Okay. Michael, you're back.
Mike,
What's up?
It's with a promised smaller question. I firmly believe that free speech should be protected, but there is a difference between speech and behavior.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to express your opinions, no matter how controversial they are. It's another thing is to yell at someone who is trying to speak and suppress their free speech. Not through your speech, but through your behavior, essentially. That can be borderline on violence. And so I'm wondering what you think that maybe instead of attempts to somehow organize the speech or enforce some speech codes or whatever the universities are trying to do, maybe it should be more about this disruptive behavior. This should be really limited. And this also enforcing the free speech, it also would enforce the rights of those who feel offended. So they should have legitimate means, venues for expressing their feelings and their opinions through their speech, not by yelling, not by protesting. So what do you think about this idea?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with that idea. And I think I've sort of touched on, my multiple levels of suspicion for working on the rules and working on the code, both because I think they might not quite work on what they're intended to do. I don't think they address the culture, and it's more of the infantilization, right? I think students should be able to have it out with each other in a real way. what drove me crazy about this Judge Duncan thing is that, you know, there were 100-some people in the mob that silenced him. And like, I disbelieve that many people, you know, I barely knew who Judge Duncan was before I didn't know who Judge Duncan was before I became president of the Federalist Society and like started inviting people. So I disbelieve that 100 people had these deep and strongly held convictions about Judge Duncan's decisions, or about even, you know, what happened, decisions from the Fifth Circuit. I think there were probably a few people who believed something, but my impression is it was more just, you know, he got the bad spot on the calendar, right? And there was sort of a need to have a ritual sacrifice, and it landed on him.
What specifically were the objections to the judge?
Yeah,
What
so
decisions?
there was a laundry list of bullet points, and they didn't cite specific decisions. So, you know, I'm sort of inferring which decisions I think they referred to. And, you know, it would be great if you could find someone from the other side to come talk to you a future week, because I think they would have some maybe different thoughts. The bullet points were very broad, right? Things like, you know, Judge Duncan has disenfranchised Black people. And there is a decision from a panel he was on that concerned, was like a gerrymandering type case out of Louisiana at the state level. And he voted with, I believe, a unanimous panel to keep the state maps, right? They didn't change the map. And like, if you read the decision, it was a pretty garden variety case where, like, you know, if you drew the map this way, you got more Black Democratic seats. If you drew it this way, you got some more Republican seats, but neither of the maps was particularly ugly, right? I mean, like, you've all seen, I'm sure, like the goofy gerrymander maps where you have like a snake attached to a wheelbarrow, and that's the district. I mean, these all just sort of looked like they were all, it was just which parishes you put together really was the question. And you could get like 2 more seats if you basically took as your principle, we want to create as many Black Democratic seats as possible. You know, you could get 2 more. You probably, you know, in a random control would have had 1 more. They kept the map where you had 0 more. So it was sort of, you know, is that disenfranchisement of Black voters? I you know, I wouldn't quite claim that, but others might. There were various allegations about how he's done bad things to the queer community. Most of those appear to be referring to Fifth Circuit precedent from panels he was not on, right? There is one case where there was a person who had been convicted as a rapist, and they identified, and everyone identified them as a man at the time of their conviction. After their imprisonment, they identified as trans, and they filed various things. One, to sort of be recategorized within the prison system and be treated in various different ways, to receive different medical care. But specifically, the big one was asking for a ruling from the court that the federal government in future pleadings had to refer to them by the new female name and female pronouns, and that prison officials had to refer to them by the new name and pronouns. And the judge basically said, like, you know, I'm not going to require anyone to do any of that, right? And that was sort of a hook, because this was seen as very, you know, anti-trans, but, you know, that I think reasonable people could disagree about what that was. And his actual decision hinges on the fact, he says, like, there's no law that gives this person the remedy they're asking for, right? The power, which maybe is a bit of a cop-out, but it actually isn't clear that a federal judge can order a prison official to refer to you by your preferred name. There probably is a law that if you come in as George and, you know, the warden refers to you only as Sweet Cheeks, maybe you could get a thing. But if you change, you know, if you adopt a new name and new pronouns, it's not totally clear that the judge can order the prison officials to refer to you by those preferred pronouns.
Okay. Get you in a minute. I'll get to you right away.
That's all right, you can take your time. I'm a believer, so where I'm coming from is that culture, values, they're on a pendulum, they swing, and they tend to level out. Now, for example, Stanford has a history in its founding of eugenics. I wouldn't
Yeah.
say that's true now.
No.
Do you sense any change or swinging in ascendancy or descendancy of this kind of fascist mob rule stuff?
So I think there is a bit of a change. And this is again anecdotal, so who knows? But when I teach and talk with undergraduates, it seems like people who are my age, so I'm 29, people who are around that like late 20s, early 30s, the young millennials, really feel like a call to be activists, really feel a chip on their shoulder about a lot of things. And we fail pretty much at everything we want to change societally, but we really care about it. It seems like the undergrads are just sort of depressed, right? They think it is what it is. You will make a life in this sort of setup and do the best you can. So I wouldn't say that's an improvement, but it's definitely a change from mob rule, because if you don't care enough to show up for the mob, or maybe don't care enough is the wrong word, if you're too depressed to show up for the mob, then there's no mob. So, I'm hoping this is just a blip, and these are the students who are most affected by COVID, right? I mean, these are the students who, like, their freshman year was, on their computer from their parents' living room. So I think that maybe this is a blip. I'm really hoping it's a blip, but there's this deep and very depressing apathy among the older Gen Zers.
Okay, Michael.
I just discovered that one email in my inbox that was sitting there from this morning, and the email was from Braver Angels, and I was not in a hurry to open it. And now I opened it and found that this is on this very topic. And specifically, they are talking about Lynn Benton Community College in Oregon, and communication professor Mark Urista had this successful experiment to combat exactly this problem on their campus. So if you're interested, I will be happy to forward this email to you.
Yes, please.
But I need to know your email address for this. But my more broad question was that I hear what you said and what others said, and the situation seems pretty grim. But what would you what are your hopes? What are your ideas about how to improve it, if any?
I mean, that's a very, very broad question. I think that I think something that is that is probably core to this problem is isolation, right? You saw people sort of check out of religious bodies and civic groups and things like that. And it's great that you guys have checked into, instead of a religious group, a humanist group. But, I couldn't tell you who the humanist group of the Stanford undergraduates are. I assume there are people who share your beliefs, but, there are the various religions have their very tiny, I mean, shockingly tiny groups of people who are still on the team. But I think most students are just sort of floating. And they maybe make some friends, but this sort of idea of having a group of people who talk about really serious and deep ethical and values-based questions, that doesn't seem to exist so much. And particularly among the Gen Zers, having the audacity to talk about those things is seen as a cringe, right? You just need to think about what you're going to do. Sort of, we know the collapse is coming, and maybe we don't want to get too deep into it, and that's very worrying. So I would hope for some sort of reamalgamation of people around some set of values, but I don't have a plan. I'm planning on not moving to a remote place with fresh water and fighting it out as long as I can, but it's with the sort of belief that, you know, the collapse may fall on me. So
Matt.
Oh, that second there, I thought somebody else in the audience was going to talk, but so it seems like all this, everything that happened on this event was actually ended up being pretty effective for, well, sort of both sides. I mean, the people protesting were able to raise their grievances up to the national stage, even if their actual message was kind of muddled. That's kind of common for those kind of groups. But then on the other side, the conservatives are able to sort of grift off of, you know, all the craziness that went around it. They were kind of able to infantilize college students, ironically, by complaining that they're being infantilized, which I think is kind of funny. But ultimately, like, both sides were able to bring their sides into the national level, and was effective for both of them. Probably was not a great experience going through it, but what do you think about that? Do you think that was good or bad or indifferent?
well, I think you've hit on something very important, which is, you know, it's not just both sides, it's almost every individual cashed on this, right? I would not have been invited to, you know, you guys never would have heard of me if this hadn't happened. And, you know, I suspect that Dean Steinbach is going to be given a lot of money to go away, and that she will land in something much better than being the DEI dean of Stanford Law School, right? I mean, she got that glowing write-up in the New York Times. They even got a good quote from me, and I'm sure she will, you know, get her walking papers and, you know, be the head of some really cool and impressive thing that never would have happened for her if not for that spectacle. Judge Duncan, who would have been, you know, one of the judges on the Fifth Circuit, who no one in America could have picked out of a lineup, is now, you know, seen as this courageous figure, and by some circle, you know, in some circles, but will be, you know, will be invited to all the cool parties on the right. And so individually, like, not just both sides, individually, everyone cashed in on this incredibly shitty situation. And so the lesson from this, you know, hopefully a lesson people don't take, but you've spotted it, is be as horrible as possible, because, you know, the more you can up the drama and the more you can increase the violence, particularly if you're already in an elite circle, that's the way to differentiate. And there aren't really any consequences, you know, long term. It'll be sort of unpleasant, and maybe you'll have some, you know, emotional or psychological residual trauma but I think people can write that down in favor of the more practical, you know, 15 seconds.
That's pretty much all I want, but I do want to mention that, I mean, you just said that there was, or you mentioned there should be more violence, or people are going to get that out of there. But from what I can tell, there was no actual violence at this event, just a lot of inappropriate talking and screaming and yelling and whatever. And I know they said some things that were violent words, I guess you could say. I don't know what the best term for that would be, but it wasn't actually violent.
I think that's right. I mean, I guess I'm talking about violence in more the Rene Girard sense, right? And I know he ultimately goes all the way to like an actual sacrifice, but I think this idea of the mob, you know, finding a victim and immolating that victim, I think that work usually in our lives happens rhetorically rather than physically, you know, in workplaces, in groups, in families. And I'm using violence in that sense, not in the sort of punching, kicking, or shooting sense.
Okay.
Paul.
What was the date of this event? How long ago was this?
Oh, I can look this up, probably. I mean, it was more than a month ago now, if that's helpful.
So is that recent? So it's
It looks like it was 23rd of March. No, that's not right. It was a month and a half. Looks like it was March 9th.
oh, COVID has sort of cut me off from a lot of things. I used to be on the campus quite a bit.
Yeah, come
But
back.
being in my 90s now, I don't go where, usually I'm wearing a mask and I expect others to. My checkered career includes some time in a dean of students office, and this sounds like that the objectors simply prohibited the speaker from speaking. That's accurate?
I mean, he was able to enter the building, so I'm clear about that, but he could not, he had a prepared speech and he did not ever get into it.
And that was because the protesters interfered.
Well, shouted him down. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Well, had that happened at the institution where I was in the dean of students office, we would have had a fewer students enrolled after that. That would simply not have been tolerated. Yeah. And I'm surprised that Stanford is willing to tolerate that. There were, whether it's the left or the right, and I'm probably to the left of where you are. But I would have wanted to hear what you had to say, in that situation. And I'm frankly surprised that Stanford is willing to tolerate that. If you just put it in terms of dollars, there was a lot of money spent to bring a speaker to campus and then not permit them to speak. Is there any write-up of this? Did the judge provide you with a copy of the speech that he expected to deliver?
He didn't give me a copy, but he did give the speech then at Notre Dame. So Notre Dame then, of course, came out and said, we would like to hear the speech. So he went and gave it there.
Okay, I'll look that up. So,
but I think in the setup for your question, you hit the big difference. You said, I think I'm to the left of you, but I would want to hear. People don't want to hear. I mean, we have this new theology. There's sort of these accepted things that we can talk about. And that's what people want to hear. If you don't want to talk about that, no need to hear from you at all.
I would say you need students who are more curious about learning new things than you apparently have.
Well, I would agree with you. But about 10 years ago, Stanford's provost gave a speech to the faculty where she said, we are looking for the next generation of activists. And activists are not, if you're picking students who are already activists, you're not looking for curious people necessarily.
You're not an activist if you don't listen to the other guy and actively respond to it. You're just you're not a student interested in learning and dealing with the ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think we sort of have to break now.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And I want to thank our Zoom audience.